Before we get started with the 5-way DuPont analysis, let us look at some key terms. The first term here is interest burden ratio. Interest burden ratio reflects the proportion of operating profit retained after interest expenses. I typically would define interest burden ratio as the income you go home with after paying interest. Interest burden ratio is EBT over EBIT. EBT is earnings before tax, EBIT is earnings before interest and tax. Some candidates struggle to remember this. To recall this formula, let us look at this concept. Assume that EBIT is 100. Also assume that the interest expense is 20. EBIT less interest expense is EBT. Assume that EBT is 80. EBT less tax expense would give us net income or net profit. Assume that the tax rate is 10%. 10% of 80 is 8. 80 less 8 will be 72. To recall this formula, the logic is this. Interest expense is between EBIT and EBT. That implies that the interest burden ratio could either be EBIT over EBT, or it could be EBT over EBIT. Since we agreed that the interest burden ratio would be less than 100%, then the formula would obviously be this. So it cannot be this. So from here, what is EBT? EBT is 80, EBIT is 100. That implies that the interest burden ratio would be 80%. Now, moving on to tax burden ratio. Tax burden ratio measures the proportion of earnings retained after accounting for taxes. I typically would say tax burden ratio is the income you go home with after paying taxes. That implies that we expect the tax burden ratio to be less than 100%. The formula for tax burden ratio is net income or net profit all over EBT. To recall this formula here, the tax expense is between EBT and net profit. So that implies that the tax burden ratio could either be EBT over net profit or net profit over EBT. But since we agreed that the tax burden ratio should be less than 100%, then it obviously cannot be this. It will obviously be this. So net profit here is 72. The EBT is 80. 72 divided by 80 is 90%. There is another formula for the tax burden ratio, and that's this. Tax burden ratio is 1 minus the tax rate. The tax rate here is 10%. 1 minus 10%, which is 0.1, would be 90%. Now, let us move on to the 5-way DuPont analysis. The basic formula for return on equity is net income or net profit over equity. If I decide to multiply by sales over sales, that's 1. asset over asset, that's still 1. If I decide to multiply by EBT over EBT, that's still 1. If I multiply by EBIT over EBIT, that is 1. So let us rearrange what we have here. Return on equity will be equal to what? If I decide to pick this and this, that would be asset over equity. Asset over equity is what we call financial leverage. If I decide to pick this against this, that will be sales over asset. Sales over asset is what we call asset turnover. Still moving on, if I decide to pick this against this, that is net income all over EBT. Net income over EBT is what we call tax burden ratio, which we agreed here. Now still moving on, if I decide to go with this against this, that is EBT over EBIT. EBT over EBIT is what we call interest burden ratio, which is what we have here. What do we have left? What we have left is this against this. That's EBIT over sales. EBIT over sales is what we call EBIT margin. You would want to agree with me that return on equity is equal to financial leverage times asset turnover times tax burden ratio times interest burden ratio times EBIT margin. EBIT margin could also be called operating profit margin. To recall the 5-way DuPont formula, I make use of these letters. NP, that is net profit, has 2 letters. EBT, that is earnings before tax, has 3 letters. EBIT has 4 letters. Sales has 5 letters. Assets has 6 letters. Equities has 7 letters. So I make use of this equation. 2 over 3. NP has 2 letters over 3. That's EBT. Then 3, which is EBT, over EBIT for 4 letters times EBIT, that's coming from here, over sales, and times sales, which has 5 letters, over assets. Asset has 6 letters times assets over equity. There is another way. I remember this 5-way DuPont analysis formula. I remember with TI. The F is financial leverage, A is asset turnover, T is the tax burden ratio, I is the interest burden ratio, and E is EBIT margin.